The forest stretched endlessly, a green sea of ancient trees and thick undergrowth, untouched by civilization. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled rays, casting fleeting patterns of light across the forest floor. Every leaf seemed to pulse with life, reflecting a vibrant palette of emerald and jade. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of unfamiliar flowers and the soft hum of alien insects that darted from bloom to bloom. In the heart of this living sanctuary, the turquoise waters of a tranquil lake lay still, a glassy mirror reflecting the greenery around it. The scene felt almost enchanted, alive with an otherworldly beauty that made it hard to distinguish where nature ended and magic began. Jason, a lone figure against this wild backdrop, stood at the water's edge. His sturdy frame was a stark contrast to the delicate foliage around him. He was a seasoned explorer, part of the Galactic Survey Corps, tasked with mapping and collecting data on this uncharted planet. Jason's build was solid, his muscles honed by years of traversing alien landscapes. He wore a light survival vest over his bare chest, his shirt long discarded in the rising heat of the day. Despite the rugged terrain, there was a sense of ease in his posture, a calm confidence that came from countless expeditions on far-flung worlds. He set his gear down, pulling off his boots and socks before wading into the cool, inviting water. Jason sighed in relief as the lake's chill seeped into his aching muscles. He floated on his back, staring up at the sky, a patchwork of blue and green framed by the treetops. For a moment, everything was still, the kind of quiet only found in places untouched by sentient life. It was a rare, perfect moment of solitude. But then something changed. A ripple in the water, subtle yet out of sync with his movements, caught his attention. Jason stopped, lowering himself into the water until only his eyes remained above the surface, scanning the opposite shore. There, emerging gracefully from the shadows, was a figure unlike any he had ever seen. She moved with a fluid elegance, her dark hair cascading in waves down her back, blending with the foliage as if she were part of the forest itself. Her skin was a deep green, almost shimmering in the sunlight, and small, horn-like protrusions peeked from beneath her hairline, giving her an ethereal, almost mythical appearance. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The alien woman, Zyra, had noticed him too. She paused at the water's edge, her wide, luminous eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and curiosity. Her gaze was piercing but not hostile. It was as though she were seeing a creature just as strange and fascinating to her as she was to him. Zyra raised a hand, palm out, a gesture that seemed half greeting, half caution. Jason hesitated, his mind racing. He knew this planet was supposedly uninhabited, marked for survey precisely because no advanced life had been detected. Yet here she was, standing before him like a living part of the forest itself. He lowered his hand slowly, showing he held no weapon, then raised one hand in a similar greeting. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other, two beings from entirely different worlds, connected by a shared moment of discovery. With a cautious smile, Jason stepped closer, wading deeper into the lake. He could feel the water lapping against his chest, the slight current swirling around his legs. Zyra watched him intently, her eyes following every movement, her expression softening as he made no aggressive moves. She took a step forward as well, the water barely reaching her hips, her gaze never leaving his. Jason spoke first, his voice low and gentle, as though he were trying not to scare off a wild animal. "Hey there," he said, knowing full well she wouldn't understand. Zyra's head tilted slightly, a curious expression crossing her face as she responded with a melodic string of words, her language musical and unlike any he had ever heard. He chuckled, holding up his hands in a gesture of confusion. "I have no idea what you just said," he admitted. Zyra mimicked his expression, a small, amused smile, almost as if she found his ignorance endearing. She pointed at herself, uttering a word that Jason assumed was her name. "Zyra. Zyra," he repeated, nodding. He pointed to himself. "Jason." She echoed the name, the sound of it twisting slightly with her alien accent. He grinned, feeling a small thrill at the sound of his name on her lips. It was a simple exchange, but it felt monumental, a bridge between their two worlds. Jason took another step closer, testing the waters of this interaction. Zyra mirrored him, meeting him halfway until they stood just an arm's length apart, the surface of the lake shimmering between them. He gestured to the forest around them, then back to her, as if to ask if this place was her home. She nodded, making a sweeping motion with her hand, indicating the entire area. As he tried to follow her gestures, Jason caught a glimpse of something almost mischievous in her eyes. Before he could react, Zyra flicked her fingers, sending a small splash of water his way. It wasn't much, just a tiny spray, but the action caught him off guard. He blinked, momentarily stunned, before breaking into a laugh. "Oh, you think that's funny?" he asked playfully, splashing back at her. His response was met with a surprised gasp, followed by a melodic laugh that filled the quiet forest. Zyra splashed him again, and for a moment, the tension dissolved. They were no longer strangers from distant stars, but two beings simply enjoying the cool water on a hot day. Jason's laughter echoed across the lake as they continued their impromptu game, the ripples from their splashes mingling and spreading out across the surface, disturbing the perfect reflection of the trees and sky. In this small act of playfulness, they found a common language, a universal understanding that went beyond words. As the splashing subsided, they stood there, panting lightly, faces lit up with genuine smiles. The lake's surface calmed once more, but the air between them buzzed with a new kind of energy, a shared connection, fragile yet profound. In this moment, surrounded by the untouched wilderness, Jason realized something important. He wasn't just exploring a new planet. He was encountering an entirely new kind of life, one that was just as curious and complex as humanity itself. And perhaps, he thought with a smile, this was only the beginning. Jason and Zyra made their way out of the lake, water cascading off their bodies as they stepped onto the sandy shore. They settled into the shallow water near the edge, sitting close enough that the cool lake lapped gently against their legs. There was a quietness to their movements now, a shared understanding that had formed in the midst of their playful splashing. It was as if they had silently agreed to set aside any fears, choosing instead to bask in the novelty of the moment. Jason's eyes roamed over Zyra, taking in her strange yet striking features. Her skin was a deep, vibrant green, mottled with patterns that resembled the leaves of the towering trees around them. He noticed the small, horn-like protrusions that crowned her head, blending seamlessly with her flowing dark hair. They gave her an almost regal look, like she belonged to this forest in a way he could never truly understand. He wondered what purpose those horns served. Were they a form of defense or merely ornamental? His curiosity was palpable, but he made sure his gaze was respectful, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. Zyra, in turn, seemed equally fascinated by him. Her eyes, bright and curious, traced the contours of his chest and arms, lingering on the smooth skin exposed by his lack of natural coverings. Jason realized then how different he must look to her. No camouflage, no natural armor, just bare flesh and muscle. He chuckled softly, flexing his arm a bit, giving her a playful grin as if to say, "This is all I've got." Zyra tilted her head, her lips curling into a small smile as she reached out tentatively, touching his shoulder with a delicate finger. The contact was brief, almost like she was testing his texture, and Jason found himself holding his breath until she pulled her hand back. Wanting to show goodwill, Jason rummaged through his pack and pulled out a protein bar, one of his last supplies from the ship. He unwrapped it slowly, making sure she could see that it was food. He held it out to her, gesturing for her to take it. Zyra eyed the bar with a mixture of suspicion and intrigue. She leaned in, sniffing it first, her nose wrinkling at the unfamiliar smell. Jason couldn't help but grin, the situation reminding him of offering treats to stray animals back on Earth. She took a small bite, chewing cautiously. Her expression shifted from cautious skepticism to surprise, then to something resembling delight. Jason watched her face light up, her eyes widening as she took another, more confident bite. He laughed, the sound a mix of relief and amusement. "You like it, huh?" he said, knowing she couldn't understand, but enjoying the moment nonetheless. Zaira made a sound that was almost like a hum of approval, finishing the bar and giving him an appreciative nod. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental to Jason, a tiny bridge built across the vast expanse of their cultural divide. Jason, encouraged by their small success, decided to share something else. He reached into his pack and pulled out his datapad, tapping a few buttons to bring up a holographic map of the area. The blue, translucent lines of the map hovered above the screen, showing the lake and the surrounding forest in intricate detail. He held it out for Zaira to see, curious about how she would react to the technology. Her eyes widened at the sight of the hologram, a flicker of awe passing across her face. She leaned in, reaching out with delicate fingers to touch the floating image. The map flickered in response to her touch, shifting slightly. Zaira's expression shifted from surprise to a look of mild boredom after a moment, as if the novelty had worn off quickly. She set the datapad aside, turning her gaze back to the vibrant forest around them, clearly more interested in the natural world than in Jason's technological gadgets. Seeing this, Jason realized that she might have something of her own to share. Zaira stood up, gesturing for him to follow as she walked towards the edge of the forest. She stopped by a low-hanging branch, plucking a strange, glowing fruit that looked like a translucent orb, pulsing softly with an inner light. Jason watched her bite into it, the juice dripping down her chin as she chewed with obvious enjoyment. She held another fruit out to him, her expression expectant. Jason hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. When in Rome, he muttered, taking the fruit from her and examining it. He took a tentative bite, and his taste buds were immediately overwhelmed by a sweet, intense flavor, followed by an unexpected rush of heat, like a pepper's kick hidden in a candy's sweetness. He coughed, his eyes watering slightly, and Zaira burst into laughter, a sound that was musical and pure. Jason couldn't help but laugh along, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You could have warned me about that," he said with a grin, his voice light. Zaira pointed at him, still laughing, clearly enjoying his reaction. It was a moment of pure, shared joy, a simple yet profound connection that required no words. They spent the next few hours wandering through the forest together. Zaira led the way, her steps light and sure as she guided Jason along hidden paths and through dense underbrush. She pointed out various plants and creatures, explaining them in her melodic language even though she knew he wouldn't understand. Jason listened anyway, nodding along, captivated by her passion and the way she seemed to belong to this place in a way he never could. He found himself experiencing the forest through her eyes, seeing its beauty and complexity in a new light. They eventually returned to the lake as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. The light danced across the surface, turning the turquoise water into a shimmering pool of liquid gold. Jason and Zaira settled back down by the shore, their bodies relaxed, their breathing in sync as they watched the sky change colors. Jason leaned back on his hands, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He glanced over at Zaira, who was sitting cross-legged beside him, her face lit up by the warm light of the setting sun. For a moment, he could almost forget that she was alien, that they were from different worlds entirely. In the silence, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a sense that they were no longer just two strangers thrown together by chance, but something more. Companions, perhaps? Friends. The sun sank lower, the last rays kissing the treetops before fading away. The forest grew quiet, as if holding its breath in the twilight. Jason and Zaira sat there, side by side, saying nothing. There was no need for words. In this peaceful moment, the bond between them was undeniable, forged not through language but through shared experience and mutual respect. Jason realized with a small, content smile that he had found something unexpected on this distant world. He had come to explore, to map uncharted territory. Instead, he had found a kindred spirit, someone who could show him a different way of seeing the universe. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he knew one thing for certain. This was a beginning, not an end. And whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in a deep blue twilight. A chorus of alien insects began their nightly song, a soft, rhythmic hum that filled the cool air. Jason leaned back on his hands, feeling the damp earth beneath his fingers. He glanced over at Zyra, who was lying on her back, her eyes closed as if she were absorbing the serenity of the evening. It was a perfect moment of peace, a fleeting slice of paradise that made the harsh realities of his life in the Galactic Survey Corps feel distant and insignificant. But the tranquility didn't last. Jason's instincts flared. A sudden chill ran down his spine, and he sat up, his senses on high alert. He couldn't place what had triggered the feeling, but something was wrong. He scanned the tree line, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for the source of his unease. Zyra's demeanor shifted as well. She sat up quickly, her body tense, her playful, relaxed expression gone. Her ears twitched slightly, the small, horn-like protrusions on her head seeming to sharpen, almost as if they could sense the danger lurking nearby. She turned her head, listening intently to the rustling in the underbrush, a sound that wasn't part of the forest's usual symphony. Without a word, they both stood, moving closer together. Jason's hand instinctively went to the sheath on his belt, pulling out his survival knife. The blade gleamed dully in the fading light, a small but reliable weapon he had used many times on expeditions. Zyra, on the other hand, bent down swiftly, her fingers closing around a jagged stone, hefting it in her hand like a makeshift weapon. Despite their different approaches, the message was clear. They were ready to defend themselves. The rustling grew louder, the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the shadows shift. Then, from the darkness, it emerged a massive wolf-like creature, easily the size of a bear. Its body was covered in glistening scales that shimmered in the moonlight, each scale reflecting a different hue like a moving mosaic. The creature's eyes were a piercing yellow, locked onto the two figures by the lake with a predatory focus. Jason took a step back, his muscles tensing as the beast snarled, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. He glanced at Zyra, whose face had become a mask of concentration. She looked at him, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "We do this together." The creature lunged. Jason dove to the side, slashing out with his knife as the beast passed him, the blade skimming across its scaled hide with a metallic scrape. The attack barely seemed to faze the creature, but it gave him enough time to regroup. He pivoted quickly, positioning himself back-to-back with Zyra. She was nimble, darting and weaving around the creature's snapping jaws, her movements fluid like water. She swung her stone weapon at its flank, hitting with a surprising force that made the beast snarl in pain. "Nice hit," Jason shouted, his voice filled with adrenaline. Zyra didn't respond with words, but the small, fierce smile she flashed him was enough. The creature circled them, its eyes narrowing, calculating. It seemed to realize that it wasn't facing a single, isolated prey anymore, but a coordinated team. It hesitated for a fraction of a second before charging again, this time with a renewed fury. The ground shook under its weight as it barreled toward them. Jason braced himself, waiting until the last possible moment before sidestepping and driving his knife deep into the creature's side. It howled, a guttural, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the forest. The creature whipped around, its tail striking Jason hard across the chest, sending him flying backward into the water. He hit the lake with a splash, the breath knocked out of him. The cold shock of the water cleared his head, but before he could regain his bearings, the beast lunged at him, its jaws snapping dangerously close to his neck. Jason thrashed, trying to push it away, but the creature was heavy, its weight pinning him down. He struggled, feeling the panic rise as he fought for air. Then, from above, Zyra let out a scream, a high-pitched, otherworldly sound that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the forest. She leapt into the water, her stone weapon raised high. With a powerful strike, she slammed it down onto the creature's head. The beast recoiled, stunned by the unexpected blow. Jason seized the opportunity, plunging his knife into the creature's neck. Blood, dark and viscous, poured out into the water, staining it. The beast let out one final, pained howl before staggering back, its strength fading. It turned and bolted, limping back into the forest, vanishing into the shadows from where it had come. The forest was silent once more, save for the sound of their labored breathing. Jason pushed himself up, coughing and spitting out water, his limbs trembling from the exertion. He looked over at Zyra, who was standing in the shallows, her chest heaving, her stone weapon still clutched tightly in her hand. They stared at each other for a long moment, the realization of what had just happened settling in. They had fought together, saved each other's lives. Jason gave a breathless laugh, dropping his knife and sinking down onto the sand. "We make a pretty good team." "Huh," he said, his voice hoarse. Zyra didn't respond with words. Instead, she gave him a look that spoke volumes. There was respect in her eyes now, a deeper understanding that hadn't been there before. Zyra knelt beside him, her expression softening as she noticed a scrape on his arm where the creature's claws had grazed him. Without hesitation, she reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a leaf, crushing it between her fingers until a bright green liquid oozed out. She gently took his arm, applying the sap to the wound. Jason winced at the sharp sting, but then felt a cool, soothing sensation spread through the cut. He looked at her surprised. "What is this? Some kind of medicine?" he asked, though he knew she couldn't answer. He gave her a grateful smile, nodding in thanks. "You saved me back there. Twice." Zyra met his gaze, her lips curving into a small, satisfied smile. She said something in her melodic language, a string of sounds that Jason couldn't understand but felt he could interpret nonetheless. It was a kind of acknowledgement, a wordless bond forged in the heat of battle. They sat there for a while, side by side on the shore, the moonlight casting a silvery glow over the lake. Jason's arm tingled pleasantly from the medicinal sap, and he found himself leaning back, exhaustion and relief washing over him. He glanced over at Zyra, who was gazing out at the dark forest, her face illuminated by the moonlight. He realized then that whatever connection they had formed before, it had now deepened into something far more profound. They weren't just curious strangers anymore. They were partners, united by the primal fight for survival. And as they sat there, bruised but alive, Jason felt a swell of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. A moment of understanding. The sun crests the horizon, bathing the forest in soft, golden light. The tranquil lake shimmers, the reflections of the alien flora dancing on its surface. Jason sits by the water's edge, gazing at the forest, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. The encounter with the predator, the shared fight for survival, and the bond that had unexpectedly formed between him and Zyra. He knows it's time for him to leave. His mission calls for him to return to his ship and report his findings. But for the first time in his career as an explorer, he feels a pang of reluctance. Zyra emerges from the tree-line, her movements quieter and more subdued than before. She approaches Jason, sensing the unspoken tension in the air. Her eyes meet his, filled with a mixture of emotions, curiosity, sadness, and a trace of something more tender, something that Jason can only describe as fondness. They stand together in silence, the early morning breeze rustling the leaves around them, carrying with it the scent of the alien forest. Jason takes a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He looks at Zyra, his expression serious but gentle. He places a hand over his heart, a gesture of farewell and respect, hoping she will understand its meaning. It's a simple sign, but it carries all the words he can't say. Zyra watches him closely, her head tilting slightly as she processes the gesture. Then, slowly, she raises her hand and mirrors it, pressing her palm over her own heart. The mimicry is perfect, but it's more than that. It's genuine. Her expression softens, and Jason realizes she understands. The parting gift. Jason knows he should leave now, but he hesitates, feeling like he needs to leave her with something more, a token, however small, to remember him by. He digs into his pack, pulling out a small, personal trinket. It's a simple bracelet made of braided cord, something he'd carried with him for years. It's worn and frayed, a reminder of his many journeys, but it holds a special, sentimental value. He steps closer to Zyra, holding it out to her. Zyra looks at the bracelet, her eyes widening slightly. She reaches out, hesitating for a moment before gently taking it from his hand. She turns it over in her fingers, studying it like it's a rare artifact. Then, she meets his gaze, her expression one of deep gratitude. She gives a small, solemn nod, tilting her head in what Jason has come to recognize as a gesture of thanks. For a moment, they simply stand there, two figures from different worlds, sharing a rare connection that transcends words. Jason feels a lump form in his throat. He wants to say something, anything, to explain the strange mix of emotions welling up inside him. But he knows that words are unnecessary now. Everything that needed to be said has already been communicated in the quiet moments they've shared. With a final nod, Jason turns and begins to walk away, his footsteps slow and heavy on the forest floor. He forces himself not to look back, focusing on the path ahead, the direction of his ship. He can feel Zyra's eyes on him, watching him leave, and it takes all his willpower to keep moving forward. After a few steps, though, he stops. He can't help himself. He turns around one last time. Zyra is still standing by the lake, holding the bracelet tightly in her hand. She raises it slightly, showing him that she's accepted his gift, that she will keep it with her. Jason gives her a small, wistful smile before finally turning away for good, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The promise of return. Zyra stands by the water, watching the spot where Jason vanished into the trees. She feels a strange emptiness, a sense of something unfinished. The forest around her is alive with the sounds of the morning, the birds and insects greeting the new day. But she feels like a part of it is missing now. She looks down at the bracelet in her hand, turning it over once more. It's such a simple thing, just a braided cord, but it feels like so much more. It's a promise, she realizes, a silent vow that this isn't the end. She raises the bracelet to her forehead, closing her eyes in a gesture of respect and farewell, one that her own people might use when honoring a fallen friend or bidding goodbye to a loved one. Then, she slips it onto her wrist, feeling the rough texture against her skin. It doesn't fit perfectly, but she adjusts it until it feels secure. The trinket feels oddly comforting, a tangible reminder of the connection she shared with this strange human. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, Zyra finally turns away from the lake, walking back into the forest. She glances over her shoulder one last time, her eyes lingering on the spot where they had fought together, where they had sat in silence, where they had laughed and shared a meal. The place already feels like a memory, a sacred ground that she will hold close in her heart. The epilogue. Jason makes his way back to his ship, the dense forest gradually giving way to the clearing where his vessel waits, its metallic hull gleaming in the morning light. He pauses at the base of the ramp, taking one last look at the forest behind him. He feels a strange pull, like a piece of him is being left behind on this alien world. He knows he should be eager to leave, to get back to his mission, but instead he finds himself whispering, "I'll be back." He steps inside the ship, the familiar hum of the engines coming to life around him. He makes his way to the cockpit, settling into the pilot's seat. As the ship lifts off, he glances out the viewport, looking down at the lush, green planet that slowly recedes beneath him. He smiles to himself, a small, hopeful grin. He knows he'll return someday, not just because the mission might require it, but because a part of him wants to. He wants to see Zyra again, to find out what lies beyond the unspoken bond they've formed. Closing narration for the YouTube video. Out there in the vast expanse of the galaxy, it's easy to feel small, to feel insignificant in the face of the unknown. But sometimes, the most profound connections aren't found through grand adventures or epic battles. They're discovered in the quiet moments of understanding, in the shared struggle for survival, and in the silent promise of a return. In this story, we see the true strength of humanity, not in its advanced technology or conquering spirit, but in its capacity to trust, to adapt, and to embrace the unknown with an open heart. This is why humanity, against all odds, finds its place among the stars.